Hello and welcome to Mobility Mastery Monday. I'm Alicia and this is your weekly source for the best tips and tools for pain relief and feeling unstoppable. And today is part 3 of our 3-part series on why being flexible doesn't mean you'll have healthy fascia necessarily, and having healthy fascia doesn't guarantee being flexible. Part 1 we talked about the major differences, and if you haven't watched that, please go watch it. We'll put a link to it. And in part 2, we talked about how to achieve both fascial release and increasing flexibility. And today, we're going to talk about the major ways they overlap and some important distinctions to understand about how fascia can appear to make you inflexible when really it's actually your body protecting you from going through a range of motion and injuring yourself. And when you release the right fascia, suddenly you become flexible, but it actually has nothing to do with your actual flexibility. So obviously I'm not going to go through the entire body and every possible scenario where fascial restriction will cause you to appear inflexible in a certain way, because we'd be here all day. But I'll give you some major examples and some common ones to be aware of that you might be experiencing. The most common by far is people who think they have inflexible hamstrings. So usually everybody who comes into my office thinks that their hamstrings are super tight and that it's going to hurt like heck when I get on there, and usually that's not the case. They're not that inflexible and it doesn't hurt. It's just other things causing it. And the number one thing that will cause your hamstrings to appear tight when they're not is a low back pain pattern. Even if you don't have low back pain, your body might actually be in a low back pain pattern. And basically what this means is something maybe in your quads, your adductors, or your IT band, or your quad hip flexors is pulling your pelvis out of alignment somehow, either into a forward rotation or a side tilt or something like that. And basically your spine is now kind of like in danger of something happening to it, and bending over is the number one thing that will actually take that endangerment into an injury scenario. So your body will stop you from doing that by contracting both the glutes and or the hamstrings, sometimes both, and stopping you. Basically it stops you from being able to bend over. Now this might be extra true if you actually have low back pain. Usually, you start going down, it's like, that's when you get the most pain. So that's the number one scenario I see this in. And the problem is actually in the quads. So when we release, the right things like the quads, or maybe it's the IT band or the adductor, and we get that pelvis back to its neutral, healthy position, and the spine is not in danger, your brain will now allow you to bend fully over because it's not in danger anymore. Having said all that, I will say there are a couple times in my office when someone actually does have truly really tight hamstrings and or fascially restricted hamstrings. Now, the fascial restrictions happen much more frequently than actually someone having super tight hamstrings. So just to say, this is where there's that overlap and some gray area, because some people are definitely simply inflexible in the hamstrings. Some other common scenarios of where fascial restriction will cause you to appear inflexible might be calf fascia being super tight, causing the ankle to appear inflexible. So if you don't have good, let's say, dorsiflexion there in the ankle, when you pull your toes up, it could be from fascial restrictions in the low calf or Achilles. And when you release those, suddenly it appears like you're flexible again. Or let's say upper body issues might be if you overuse your pecs or your subscap or your lats, you might have difficulty, let's say, stretching this way. I wouldn't even necessarily call this a stretch though, but it impacts your range of motion. And some people might consider that a flexibility issue, but it's actually a fascial restriction issue. Another common one with the upper body might be like not being able to put your arm behind your back. And that's actually a fascial restriction issue, usually in the biceps or the deltoid or the chest. And when you release that, boom, suddenly you have it. So those are some common examples of when fascial release and fascial restriction can impact range of motion or flexibility. Another super common thing to think about in terms of like maybe appearing inflexible would be if you had a major break or traumatic injury where you have scar tissue. that scar tissue will definitely appear to decrease your flexibility, but it's actually the fascia that is kind of stuck. And when you release it, you get an increase in flexibility. And are there any scenarios where it's maybe a good idea to increase flexibility to either prevent injury or something like that? The answer is yes. They're less common in my experience, but I actually have something I want to do an experiment with on camera, so we may get to that in the coming months, and that would be my quads. So I was a child gymnast and my quads just exploded when I was little with all that power running and just, you use your quads a lot as a gymnast. So my hamstrings are hyper flexible. I mean, I can do that no problem, but every time I go into an acute hamstring contraction, like let's say trying to strengthen my hamstrings doing a hamstring curl, they want to cramp. I mean, almost without fail, every time. And the reason has nothing to do with my hamstrings, because they're hyper flexible. The problem is my quads. My quads are so tight, fascially, yes, but also the muscle fibers, I believe, are shortened. That it's impacting my ability to contract my hamstring due to something called reciprocal inhibition. So in order to contract my hamstrings, the quad muscles have to lengthen. Same with when I contract the quad muscles, the hamstring has to lengthen. Now, I have no problem with that whatsoever. That's what my body's used to doing. So this is a scenario that I want to play with because I'm really curious if I were to attempt to lengthen my quad muscle fibers, not the fascia, would those hamstring cramps go away when I try to do an acute hamstring curl or something like that. So that's kind of something I'm experimenting with right now. I don't have the full answer for you, but hopefully I will in the coming months. So to wrap this whole series up, basically, you can kind of see where there's definitely some overlap. It's really important to understand the distinctions of if you need fascial release to increase flexibility in certain areas, or if you actually need to increase flexibility. And hopefully you got out of this maybe the number one thing that I have realized over the last 8 years, which is kind of surprising. The fascia is much more important and affects or impacts pretty much everything in our body, including flexibility, a lot more than, let's say, your flexibility will impact the fascia. So if you have an injury or you're in pain or anything like that, chances are it's not a flexibility issue, it's a fascial restriction issue. And if you have a range of motion problem, chances are it's probably a fascial restriction issue also, not necessarily a flexibility one. Most of us have the flexibility we need to live our lives easily and be pain-free, but most of us have unhealthy fascia just from living in a body and using it since we were able to walk. So that's a wrap for this 3-part series. I hope you found it as fascinating as I do. And if you enjoyed it, then maybe like it and share it. And for the full blog post of this 3rd part, you can click the link below. And I will see you next time on Mobility Mastery Monday.